Hi, it's Bighara with another installment of my video blog. Recently, Goodman Games released their beta rules for their Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG, and a lot of blogs and reviewers and websites have been talking about it. I actually had the chance to play a version of the beta back at GaryCon in March, and I'll just say I had a lot of fun playing it. Harley Stroh ran the game, and it was neat. It had a lot of little twists and stuff that made it a little bit different than just playing another D&D clone or anything like that. I'm not really going to try and review the rules here. I haven't really read closely through the whole book yet. I got the PDF and I've flipped through it, but haven't done, like I say, a thorough reading. But it brought to mind a topic which comes up, at least in our group, from time to time, and you see it on message boards and blogs and things like that, and that's the subject of the whole, I guess you would call it the heroic versus gritty or low fantasy, or there's a lot of different terms for it, but basically the idea of not just power levels but the tone of the game as well. And it got me thinking about the fact there are certain games that sort of bill themselves as more geared towards one versus the other, and so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. I personally, and my group, and some of the products that Faster Monkey puts out and things, we tend towards the slightly more low fantasy or grittier kinds of adventures and settings and things like that, at least as far as the stuff we write, and within the general umbrella of things like, classic D&D. So we still have things like, elves and orcs and wizards and everything else, but we have a tendency to, and myself personally, have a tendency to go for the more humanocentric, less magical, less powerful kinds of magic and that sort of thing. And that's really just a matter of taste. There are people that prefer a more high fantasy or a more magical game, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, like I say, some people prefer one style versus the other, and it's not absolute. I mean, sometimes you want to play a really powerful or a very, very magical kind of game where you might have things like magical creatures as PCs, or just being very common, well, relatively common, you know what I mean, as opposed to something where, even seeing something like a dwarf PC might be incredibly rare, if not actually just removed from the setting or the system. The big difference in terms of things like playing this in games like Labyrinth Lord or Classic D&D or Osric or any of these kinds of games, as opposed to a game like maybe the Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG, is whether one is really written for a given style of play versus the other. And I've always found that D&D, at least in the older editions, even more so I guess in the newer editions, has been geared toward, at one point or another in the characters' lives or in the campaign, a certain escalation of magic and power and things like that. And this is evident by things like the nature of magic items. If you look at things like the treasure tables, how often these kinds of magic items might appear in loot that they find or what have you, spells that clerics and magic users and the like are able to get at certain levels, the abilities and powers of certain creatures, not just dragons, but you have things like basilisks that can turn you to stone, level draining undead, and all sorts of things that have these special powers just beyond they're bigger or tougher or do more damage. And so it seems to me that the idea is, if you're playing a sort of right out of the book game of D&D, that it's intended that you get to a certain power level at a certain point, and it's intended that the settings support things like dragons or demons or wizards with certain level spells or certain kinds of magic items and so forth and so on. It's intended that at a certain point, if a character dies, that the party has the resources, whether it's connections with powerful clergymen or just cash or a powerful cleric in the party that can possibly do a raise dead or even a resurrection and just bring that character back to life. I know not to go into a lot of ancient history, but when I used to play first edition D&D back in AD&D back in high school, we got to a certain point where we had characters that were 10th, 12th, 15th, 17th level, and you needed someone resurrected. You just cast resurrection on them. Or I think there was a cleric who was one of my characters who actually had a rod of resurrection. Actually, I think he had a couple. Anyway, point being, that option was open to you. It was not this earth-shattering magic. And that went for things like plane shifting, wish, stuff like that. These were all sorts of powers that characters had available, and they were dealing with things like extraplanar creatures, licks, dragons, etc. These were that you were well beyond kobolds and copper pieces and stuff like that, and it was a lot of fun. As a DM now, as I'm a little older, maybe a lot older, I have found myself leaning more towards the lower power games. I find them more challenging. I find them more interesting because it's something where it seems more realistic in a certain level. You're not finding huge treasure chests full of diamonds the size of your fist. You're not running around with swords that burst into flame or let you fly. Whatever. And again, it's a question of preference. It's not a question of one's a better style of play or another. But back to what I was going to say before about things like games like the DCC RPG and the new Hackmaster Basic is another good example of that kind of a game to a certain degree. These are things where that's sort of almost hard-coded into the rules. It's not that you can't play a more magical or more powerful game with them, I think. And in the case of the Hackmaster Basic, of course, they're coming out with the Advanced Hackmaster, which will take you to higher levels. This is literally almost like the old Holmes Basic D&D, where it's intended only to take you through the first couple levels, and so it doesn't include rules for high power or high level play or really powerful magic items, because the idea is when you get to that point you're supposed to be using the other books, which are not out yet, but you get the idea. The Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG, I'm not sure. I think a lot of the promo stuff they're doing seems to bill it as, they say things like, you're no hero, you're just out for the loot and all this, and it's going for that kind of grittier, old school feel, which is cool, but is in a sense a limitation in saying if you play this game, you're playing this game because that's the kind of campaign you want to have. Whereas you can take something like Basic Expert D&D or Rules Cyclopedia or First Edition Advanced D&D or one of the retro clones, and I think you can play any kind of game you want. I know, like I say, when we do things and we write things for Master Monkey for Labyrinth Lord, we've written things like our Lesserton and More product, some of the modules, and we've done things where we haven't really changed a lot of rules. We've just simply toned it down, and you can tailor it so that, let's say you want to have a setting where there are no elves, there are no dwarves, it's only humans. Well, that's easy enough. You just don't use those creatures. You don't offer those PC types. Let's say you want to not offer magical weapons beyond a certain ability. Like, say you don't want a bunch of +3, +4 weapons running around. So you say, no, I'm not doing anything more than +1 or +2. That's fine too. The only thing there is you're going to stop and say, are there any creatures in my campaign, in my setting, which, can only be hit by +2 weapons or better, or +3 weapons, and am I including those creatures but not including a weapon that could potentially hurt them? Because there you're running into a case of have you, hobbled the characters that they might face a challenge they can't win. I mean, obviously they could try to run away and stuff, but if the intention is that they defeat some terrible, demon lord or whatever it is, they ought to have a means to do that. And you can do a lot of other things. One of my favorites is to say, well, the spell list is the spell list, but when you're a wizard, you don't just get a new spell. You don't pick a new spell each time you level and say, well, my new second level spell is invisibility. You have to roll randomly, or you can say, no, you have to find that. You have to find spells. So you have to, when you fought that evil wizard, you could take his spell book and you can try and get spells out of there, and there's a % chance that you can learn them, like in Advanced D&D or in the AEC with Labyrinth Lord. And what that does is sort of limit how many spells a magic user has to choose from, as well as doing things like making it more important to him to adventure to go find them, make him actually really want for his loot things like old spell books or scrolls, and it gets back to sort of almost a resource management thing. Point being, you don't have to do it that way, but these are all things you can do without radically changing the game mechanics, and just use something like a retro clone or D&D and just play that lower power or grittier kind of a game. You just don't hand out as many healing potions. You just don't hand out as many magic items. You don't, even if you give them lots of cash for treasure, you maybe limit the availability of certain goods. You can't just walk into a shop and just buy plate mail. Maybe it takes a month to make, or something like that, or you have to be in a big city where there's an armorer who knows how to make that. It's complicated stuff. The point, you get the idea. The point is, I don't know that you have to go with a game that's specially made for this sort of style of play, if that's what you want to do. Now, all that said, I had a lot of fun playing the DCC RPG when I went to GaryCon. I had a lot of fun playing the Hackmaster Basic game when I went to GaryCon. I'm actually thinking about running a Hackmaster Basic game for a couple of my friends as a very occasional kind of a game. There's a lot of fun things about all those systems, and I'm not putting any of them down. I'm just saying that I think that marketing or touting that style of play is just that it's a style. It's not something it's not inherent to a given game system or another. Obviously certain games it works easier than others, but I think just taking your classic D&D rulebook, something like Basic Expert or Labyrinth Lord or First Edition or what have you, you can run that kind of game if you want, and it won't involve pages and pages of house rules, and it won't involve hours and hours of retrofitting or anything like that. But again, it's something I always harp on. If that's the kind of game everybody wants, everybody going into that game should understand you're running a low power, gritty kind of a game. You're running a game where they're not going to be finding lots of magic items and so forth and so on. That said, as sort of a parting shot on that, because I've been running pretty long on this ramble, I think there needs to be some sort of payback. They need to get some sense of reward. They need to get, either you're giving them more experience for completing adventures instead of just monster kills and loot, if you're ratcheting those things back, or they need to be getting something, some resource or benefit in some other form, possibly in terms of connections to powerful individuals who can help them, property, things like that. They need to be gaining something. I mean, if they slog through all this with fewer resources and work that much harder and level that much slower, and they're getting nothing for it, it's going to be a rare group that's going to find that fun for an extended period of time. But anyway, that's all for now. Take it easy.